Hello, welcome to yet another PowerPoint lecture thingy for my Anglo-American University students in Comparative Worldviews. If you are not enrolled at AAU, well, you should be, but also welcome. You don't have to be enrolled as one of my students to enjoy this, and I hope you'll get something from it. So today we are following up the lecture on theistic existentialism with atheistic existentialism. Existentialism, but without God. And we're going to look especially at the most famous atheist existentialist, Jean-Paul Sartre. And please don't say Sartre. That's just wrong. So, atheistic existentialism is a way to try to carve out a meaningful life in an otherwise absurd, meaningless universe through passionate choosing. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, and we'll unpack that. But, we're going to unpack it by getting into Jean-Paul Sartre's life and his most famous existentialist work, Being and Nothingness. But remember, your reading, students, was No Exit. And I'll refer to that in a while, but it's not going to be the main focus. We'll deal with that in class. So Jean-Paul Sartre was born in 1905 in Paris. His father was a second lieutenant in the Navy, and he died of a tropical fever when Jean-Paul was just 1.5. After his father's death, mother and child returned to live with her parents. Sartre's grandfather, a man named Charles Schweitzer, and if you're familiar at all with theology and stuff, I think he's related to Albert Schweitzer, who was very famous as a biblical theologian, biblical critic. Anyway, Sartre's grandfather, Charles Schweitzer, was a language scholar and a domineering old man. And if you want to say, no, they weren't related, no skin off my teeth. Just put it in the comments or whatever. But anyway, this guy was a domineering old man, and he doted on little Jean-Paul. He would be a major influence in Sartre's life. One day when Sartre was 7 years old, while his daughter was out, the old man took Sartre to a barber and had Jean-Paul's baby curls cut off, very much against his mother's wishes. With his baby curls gone, it was hard to avoid the fact that Jean-Paul was just plain ugly. He suffered from what is called strabismus in his right eye. He would eventually lose sight in that eye altogether. So Sartre used his intelligence and cleverness as sort of compensation in order to get attention. When he was 10, he began writing poems and stories, even novels, to entertain his relatives, though he was only an average student in school. During World War I, Sartre's mother got remarried, which left Jean-Paul feeling betrayed. He felt alone in the world. And I said in French, Je suis tout seul dans le monde, which is I am all alone in the world, all alone. Le sigh. In 1923, at the age of 18, Sartre was drafted into the army, but given the routine exemption to study. He passed his entrance exams and enrolled in Paris's École Normale Supérieure at the Sorbonne, which is, if you're a French intellectual, that is the school to go to. Foucault went there, Bourdieu went there. It was the place to be. Durkheim went there. A lot of people went there. Anyway, he did well at first, Jean-Paul Sartre did. But later he allowed himself to become distracted by his writing projects, his university friendships, and his love affairs. He flunked part of the baccalaureate examination and placed last in his class. His grandfather was deeply shocked and disappointed. And grandson, I am disappointed. You guys may not recognize that, but years ago, there is a now dank meme that was, "Son, I am disappoint." Look it up. The next year, 1929, Sartre took the exam again, and this time he placed first, followed by fellow philosophy student Simone de Beauvoir, with whom he would later have a lifelong love affair. While he and de Beauvoir were together, he had dozens of other mistresses. They had what they called an open relationship, where they would tell each other about their affairs in detail with other people. Today, they are buried next to each other in Paris. So, after he graduated, he spent 18 months in military service and then taught at a gymnasium, a high school, an academic high school. In 1933, Sartre took leave from his teaching job to travel to Germany to study the writings of Edmund Husserl, the father of the philosophical approach known as phenomenology. We will discuss phenomenology a little later. He also studied with Husserl's most famous student, Martin Heidegger, from whom he borrowed quite a lot. Many of Sartre's critics accuse Sartre's philosophy of being simply a restatement of Heidegger. And in truth, you can see Heidegger's fingerprints in many places in Sartre's writings, especially in the concept of Angst, that is, human existence suspended in a meaningless, absurd universe, being towards death, that is, human life being only authentic when it takes into account its own finitude, its own negation in death, and the idea of thrownness, that is, each of us is thrown into a situation we did not make and can't do much about. I mean, we can do much about it, but we didn't make the situation. We didn't start the fire, to quote Billy Joel. But Sartre uses these ideas in a way that is all his own. In 1937, he also experimented with the drug mescaline, which is a hallucinogenic chemical found in the peyote cactus, which some Native American tribes use for spiritual experiences. He apparently had a very bad reaction to it, and it left him feeling somewhat paranoid. For a year later, he had the sneaking and unshakable suspicion that he was being followed by a giant lobster. You don't get this kind of content from every philosophy lecture, let me tell you. In 1939, France and Britain declared war on Germany, and Sartre was again drafted into the army. He was an army meteorologist, and while on duty in eastern France, he began reading Soren Kierkegaard. He was very much influenced by Kierkegaard. By the way, my old professor said the correct pronunciation is Kierkegaard, but that just sounds so weird in English. I'm going to just stick with Kierkegaard. He was very much influenced by Kierkegaard, especially Fear and Trembling, which, if you've dived into the neo readings and stuff like that, you can actually read part of being Fear and Trembling. And maybe I've assigned it to you. Depends. It might not be too much of an overstatement to say that Sartre's philosophy is simply Kierkegaard's philosophy, but you replace God with nothingness. But back to World War II. The first German soldier that Sartre saw was the one who took him prisoner, and he spent the rest of the war in a POW camp where he worked on a major philosophical book that would later become his famous Being and Nothingness, published in 1943. And I need to give a shout out to philosopher and cartoonist Donald Palmer. Students in my class will recognize Palmer's style. I have gotten so much mileage from his cartoons, and I wanted to acknowledge that. And this is from his Intro to Philosophy book, Does the Center Hold an Intro to Western Philosophy, second edition, published in 1996. So go buy the book. He's really super helpful. Okay, so we've left Sartre in a POW camp. After 9 months of imprisonment, Sartre was, depending on which biography you read, was either set free for medical reasons or he escaped. And he returned to France and taught at a gymnasium there, replacing a Jewish teacher who was forbidden by the Vichy government from teaching and very likely deported. He was also active in some literary resistance activities, underground newspapers, and so forth. After the war, he became famous as an existentialist, though by this time he was becoming more attracted to Marxism. I believe that he felt that the existentialism of being and nothingness left very little room for ethics and political engagement, and Marxism offered that. Though he never joined the French Communist Party, he did become a strong defender of the Soviet Union and Stalin, even to the point of blinding himself to unpleasant realities such as politically motivated murders. And even if they did happen, he said, we should remain quiet about them, lest they be used as anti-revolutionary propaganda. Nice call, Sartre. In fact, he supported the death sentence for anti-revolutionaries in communist countries. He ended his long friendship with Albert Camus, another existentialist writer. When Camus criticized Stalin, it wasn't until the invasion of Hungary in 1956 and the crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968 that Sartre turned from his romance with the Soviet Union, though he would later write glowingly about the wonders of Maoist China and Castro's Cuba. He was also very active in the protest against the French colonialist occupation in Algeria, and was targeted by a far-right group called the OAS, the Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, for assassination because he had an Algerian mistress whom he later adopted as a daughter. Yes, it's kind of as weird as it sounds. A bomb actually exploded in Sartre's apartment, forcing Sartre to relocate to a safer address. He kept writing philosophy, desperately trying to reconcile existentialism and Marxism in his, for instance, critique of dialectical reason. He wrote plays and novels. In 1964, he famously turned down the Nobel Prize for Literature for his novel The Words, saying he didn't wish to align himself with institutions or their honors. He was also active in the student demonstrations in France during the late 1960s. By 1977, he conceded that he was no longer a Marxist. He continued writing, often using study drugs to give him energy. And the combination of smoking, excessive drinking, drugs, and overwork finally caught up to him, and his health deteriorated. He died in 1980 of an edema, that is a swelling because of a fluid overload in his lungs. Sometime during the last period of his life, there is evidence that he started doubting even his atheism. In 1974, he gave an interview to his lover, Simone de Beauvoir, published as, quote, a conversation about death and God, close quote, in which he expressed an interest in Messianic Judaism, that is Jewish Christianity, and saying that he was, quote, a being, it seems, that could, it seems, come only from a creator, close quote, though he immediately adds that he was still an atheist and considered his atheism to be a source of personal and ethical power. Let me give you the context for that quote from the original interview. So Sartre says, even if one does not believe in God, there are elements of the idea of God that remain in us and that cause us to see the world with some divine aspects. De Beauvoir responds, what, for example? Sartre says, that varies according to the person. De Beauvoir, but for you, Sartre, I don't see myself as so much dust that has appeared in the world, but as a being that was expected, prefigured, called forth. In short, as a being that could, it seems, come only from a creator. And this idea of a creating hand that created refers me back to God. Naturally, this isn't a clear, exact idea that I set in motion every time I think of myself. It contradicts many of my other ideas, but it is there, floating vaguely. And when I think of myself, I rather think in this way for want of being able to think otherwise. Because the consciousness in each man vindicates his way of being, and it is not there like a gradual formation or something built up by a series of chances, but on the contrary, like a thing, a reality that is continually present, that is not formed, that is not created, but that appears to be continually present as a complete whole. And consciousness, I may add, is consciousness of the world. So one is not quite sure whether one means consciousness or the world, and consequently one is back in reality once more, de Beauvoir. Apart from that feeling of not being here by chance, are there other fields in which there are traces of God? In the moral field, perhaps. Sartre, yes, in the moral field I've retained one single thing to do with the existence of God, and that is good and evil as absolute, as we've talked about, students. Good and evil as absolute. The usual consequence of atheism is the suppression of good and evil. It's a certain relativism. For example, it's regarding morals as being variable according to the point on the Earth's surface at which they are seen. Which, by the way, this is light years away from the moral perspective of existentialism, as we shall see. Okay, so hang on. There are even pretty substantial rumors that Sartre converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. According to Catholic writer and priest John S. Donne, no related to the English poet, who teaches or has taught, I haven't checked to see if he's still teaching, at Notre Dame University, or Notre Dame for you Americans. A friend of his was called to Sartre's deathbed, where Sartre made a confession and was accepted into the Catholic Church. There are many, because it was not well documented, many have dismissed it as urban myth. And I'm going to put a link in the description called Bridges and Tangents, somebody's blog, which talks about it. The guy who writes the blog said, it's just an urban myth, and somebody comes back and says, no, here's a quote from this guy, and the guy who said it was an urban myth said, okay, it may be true, it's just really poorly documented. So we just can't say for certain, but it looks maybe possible. In any case, and here's fuel to the fire. In any case, after Sartre's death, de Beauvoir published an angry article in which she denounced Sartre as a traitor who, quote, fell into superstition. If Sartre did convert, he's in good company. His fellow existentialist, Albert Camus, also seems to have become a Christian shortly before his death. A book that came out in the year 2000 called Albert Camus and the Minister revealed that Camus was in discussion with a Protestant Christian minister named Howard Mumma shortly before his death in 1960. And Camus swore this group to secrecy for 40 years. Apparently Mumma, Camus asked to be baptized, and Mumma said, nah, you're not ready yet. And then Camus died. So that's that. Sartre lies buried in Paris next to Simone de Beauvoir. Some 50,000 Parisians lined the streets to view his funeral procession, or as some called it, quote, the protest against Sartre's death, close quote. You know the French. They're always protesting or going on strike about something. And that is the end of Sartre's life. Now, if you're a student of mine, and you've made it this far, but you haven't done the reading yet, stop and do the reading and answer the reading questions, which we will discuss in class. We'll have a dialogue. If you've already done it, or you're not a student of mine, then by all means, proceed. So let's put atheistic existentialism, or at least Sartre's version of it, into context. And his was, without a doubt, the most popular and influential version in the 1950s and 1960s. It arose in a very particular and, might I say, peculiar historical context, that of German Nazi occupation of France, the Vichy government, the puppet government of the Nazis, and the French resistance. In other words, even though Sartre claimed that existentialism had a universal validity because, after all, it was supposed to be a presuppositionless, purely phenomenological view of human nature, the historical context certainly influenced the formation of existentialism. Sartre and his compatriots lived in a world where things seemed absurd, where there was an immense pressure to conform to that absurd and humiliating reality in which France was defeated and her leaders were hypocrites and conformists, where the only way to maintain your integrity was to resist. All of these themes, absurdity, choice, conformity, resistance, play a huge role in Sartre's existentialism. Now, let's talk about the philosophical context. Sartre's method in being and nothingness was what he had learned from Husserl's writings and seen put into practice by Martin Heidegger, and it was called phenomenology. If you haven't heard about phenomenology, that's okay. Lots of people haven't. Phenomenology, put very simply, seeks to approach experience by suspending all presuppositions. This is called the epoche. I had a graduate school teacher who once insisted that it was pronounced epoche, which doesn't even recognize the accent on the E, but it's actually a Greek word, epoche, or epoche. And what does that mean? It means to experience life not as it seems naturally, but to suspend all of your assumptions, every single assumption you have about the world around you, and simply experience what you experience as pure phenomena, as pure experience without any expectations, and then to describe that pure experience, that pure phenomena, in as much detail as you could muster. So if you're looking at a chair and you're a phenomenologist, you would not say, oh, that's a chair, or even that is a physical object. You want to examine and describe just the pure visual field of your sense experience and how it feels and all of the things you're experiencing without any assumptions whatsoever. Now, it is a matter of debate whether you can actually pull that off, whether you actually can suspend all presuppositions, but that was Husserl's theory anyway. Sartre believed his existential philosophy was likewise an assumption-free phenomenological description of experience, especially the experience of self. And by the way, the picture is of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who's another phenomenologist, but said, you know, I don't think you can actually pull it off. So even between phenomenologists, there's debate. But that's what Sartre thought he was doing, a presuppositionless description of pure experience. Sartre starts this examination, this phenomenological examination, where Descartes started, with the self. But in this case, he tries to describe the self phenomenologically as pure experience. And what he finds is not a simple thinking thing, as Descartes found, but rather a split self. And for those of you who don't read French, Jean-Paul, qu'est-ce que c'est que tu fais? C'est brutal. Jean-Paul, what are you doing? That's brutal. Descartes would say to Sartre, if Descartes were alive. Okay, so what Sartre found was not a single thing, a single self, a thinking thing, but he found a self and a consciousness of self. In other words, there is a split in consciousness. There's an experience of consciousness, and then there's something else reflecting on that consciousness, something watching and analyzing and planning and questioning and doubting. People in the 60s used to call it the third eye, right? The thing that's looking at you doing the thing. That split in consciousness for Sartre means that human existence is fundamentally different from all other types of existence. Most types of existence, the existence of chairs, or of rabbits, of buildings, of clouds, or whatever, these he called being in itself, l'être en soi. And being in itself, just be, it just is. It has a certain thingness about it. But because of this reflective, questioning, interpreting part of the consciousness, we are also l'être pour soi, being for itself, which is completely different. It is a type of existence for which nothing is given. Being in itself, everything's just a given. For being pour soi, nothing's a given. Nothing is decided. Nothing is closed off. In my experience, therefore, I am present to myself, but not as a given, but rather as a nothing, as a nothingness, as an existential negativity. Therefore, being for itself is marked by a kind of rootlessness, for it has no essential nature, except this openness to the future. It's always moving, always choosing its path. That existential nothingness, that not having a definite nature, is, Sartre believed, the root of human freedom. He wrote, quote, "Man is free because he is not a self, but a presence to self." In other words, close quote. In other words, man doesn't have a nature. Human beings don't have a nature. The only nature we have is a void, a conscious choosing. Or in the words of his famous slogan, existence precedes essence. That is, we are essentially what we make ourselves to be. There is no pattern, there is no guide, very much unlike Christian theism, which Donald Palmer's wonderful illustration says, there's an ideal being created in the image of God, and then God creates us. Our essence precedes our existence. For the human being, according to existentialist, there is no God, there is no essence, just existence. You are. Sartre liked quoting Dostoevsky from the brothers Karamazov, the brother Alyosha, who Sartre quotes him as saying, "If there is no God, everything is permitted," close quote. That is, if God, if he existed, would mean a profound unfreedom for human beings, because we would be defined as his creatures, as those being made in the image of God and so forth. And I need to call out Sartre here, because that's actually not what Dostoevsky wrote. The closest he comes to that was when Alyosha says in the Brothers Karamazov, quote, "But what will become of men then, I asked him, without God and the immortal life? All things are permitted then? They can do what they like?" It's a question, it's not a statement. Close quote. And Alyosha didn't say it's a question, not a statement. That was me. By the way, Sartre argued in Being and Nothingness that the existence of God was an impossibility, because God would have to be perfectly a being in itself, a l'être en soi, that is self-conscious, a being for itself, l'être pour soi, that is self-conscious, choosing, open, to the future dynamic, and he would also have to be a being in itself, l'être en soi, perfect, closed, no need for development. However, his argument is only valid if, number one, you accept his phenomenological description as completely valid, that is, as truly presuppositionless and neutral, and I have serious doubts as to whether that's possible in any phenomenological analysis, and specifically, I wonder if his epoche is truly neutral. He had like a vested interest. And number two, you would have to accept his description of ontology, of the philosophy of ultimate being, as valid for the whole universe, including God. And I'm not so sure it is if God existed. If God exists, then surely he would have a fundamentally different being than us and the rest of the universe. His being wouldn't conform to the rules of being that bind us. He would transcend categories in which we are held captive, like being in itself versus being for itself, for example. And that's just one way of saying God mysteriously transcends our experience, our rules, the things that bind us, like eternity and being time-bound. In other words, Sartre is saying about God that if it violates my categories, it cannot exist. But I would push back and say we should expect an eternal, infinite being to violate our categories. And if you think back about my critiques about atheistic naturalism, or even Enlightenment deism, students, remember what I said about autonomous man making his epistemological categories legislative of reality. That is, what we think we can know becomes all of a sudden that which can exist, and anything we cannot know for sure can't exist. This is a very clear example right here. If my net doesn't catch it, it can't be fish. If my epistemological net doesn't approve of it, then it's outside the possibility of being. So I personally do not find Sartre's atheistic proof very convincing. But back to his account of freedom. So what is the self? Is it being in itself or being for itself? Well, it's both. Intention. On the one hand, there are certain givens that I cannot do anything about. I can't change my DNA. I can't change my upbringing. I can't change certain choices I've made in the past that affect my presence. I can't change my language, my native language. I cannot change my ethnicity, and so forth. Sartre calls these factors facticity. There are certain facts that we cannot get away from, certain ways that my context has shaped me that I can't just snap my fingers and make them change. But Sartre is very clear that he does not follow atheistic naturalists who believe that we are determined. He says we are never determined to choose in one way and not another. Now, he never really explains how it could be true given his atheistic naturalistic assumptions about reality, how we could actually have free will and it not just be an illusion. And believe me, I've done a deep dive on this, and I've found nowhere that he actually explains how it's possible for us to really truly, certainly have free will. It is helpful to remember that he is doing phenomenology, not metaphysics. He is suspending assumptions about reality. We seem to have free will. We experience the necessity to choose, and we must act upon that necessity. We always have, according to Sartre, or seem to have, the ability to engage our situation in freedom. He calls this transcendence, that we can always transcend our circumstances by choosing. In making choices, we are essentially choosing our future selves. He writes, quote, "I await myself in the future where I make an appointment with myself on the other side of that hour, of that day, or of that month. In choosing, we're choosing a future self that we make an appointment with. I don't think it was Sartre, but I think it's Palmer who wrote about an illustration about hikers, 5 different hikers on a hike, and they come to a place where there's a boulder that's landed right in the middle of the trail, and there's a steep drop down, and it's not really easy to get over. And one of them says, it's useless. It's too big to move. We just ought to go back. That hiker's choosing himself in the future as defeated. And there's another one who's like, oh, but do you see the light? Like the way the boulder captures the light? It's so beautiful. This hiker is choosing himself as aesthetic. Another one says, wow, I wonder what kind of physical forces and erosion were necessary for that boulder to kind of come down. I mean, it was pretty firmly attached up there last time we came through here. I wonder what the process was. That one is choosing himself as analytical and scientific. Another one says, no, there's no way we're giving up. And he starts scrabbling up the rock and seeing if he can climb over it. He's choosing himself as defiant. And another one says, no, this is just too much. And he throws himself off the cliff. And he's choosing himself as suicidal. Okay? In making choices, we choose ourselves in the future. But fleeing from either of these realities, facticity, the facts that shape us, or transcendence, the fact that we can always choose, fleeing from either of those, Sartre calls that inauthenticity or bad faith. In the one case where facticity dominates, I pretend that I am not free, that I don't have a choice, because I'm just that way, or these are the realities of my life. But that's just the point. There are no realities of life that make me what I am. I can still choose. I can still push back and fight for who I want to be. But I pretend to be a victim of circumstances. I deceive myself into thinking I don't have a choice and allow myself to be defeated by life. On the other hand, in the other case where transcendence dominates, I can pretend that I can just snap my fingers and remake reality by just wishing it were so that there is no reality I must engage and fight against in order to impose my will on it. And if you're listening real hard, you can hear some Nietzsche in there, can't you? About struggling and fighting and overcoming. Existence, Sartre says, is a struggle. It's not simply wishing to be God. It's not simply altering reality through the power of positive thinking or whatever. Just because you say it's so doesn't make it so. Just because you're into New Age doesn't mean you can remake reality. Just because you want something to manifest doesn't mean that it works that way. Not for Sartre. The universe does not conform to your desires. It does not respond to your positive energy. So Sartre would say, no. Manifestation, New Age, all that stuff is illusion. You must fight. It is a struggle. So in either case, if I flee facticity or if I flee transcendence, my existence is inauthentic. If I flee facticity or if I take refuge in facticity and say, nah, it's useless, I don't have any choices, this is just how it is, or if I hide and make my refuge in transcendence alone, where I say, I can do whatever, the universe is my, the universe conforms itself to my desires. In either case, my existence is authentic because I'm denying the struggle imposed on me by my freedom and the responsibility my freedom brings with it to fight for my choices. He gives a couple of examples, and this one is from Being and Nothingness, page 498. which says the woman's date makes it's two people in a movie theater or whatever. The woman's date makes a subtle move on her. He grasps her hand, and she doesn't quite know what to do. She doesn't want to offend him or appear to be prudish, but she really doesn't know whether she wants to have a relationship with him either. So she does nothing. She somehow manages to detach herself from the situation as if her body really doesn't concern her, and while he moves in on her, her hand seems not to belong to her at all. That's an inauthentic way of being, where you're not actually engaged in the situation. Or he also uses the example of a waiter who is so dedicated to his job that he, quote, makes himself into an object, close quote. He is nothing but waiter. He is nothing more than his role in society. And for those of you who are connoisseurs, you know that this is the waiter sketch from Monty Python and Monty Python's Flying Circus. Sartre believes that we are free to choose our paths, but in saying this, he isn't just saying what common sense tells us. Well, of course we have choices to make, blah, blah, blah. Rather, being essentially nothing or nothingness, being an existential negativity, we have absolutely no guides, nothing external that justifies our choices, nothing that guarantees that we are doing the right thing, because there is no right thing. Not essentially. We are alone, and therefore no one but we ourselves can claim responsibility for our actions. He says we are condemned to freedom. He writes in Being in Nothingness, man can will nothing unless he has first understood that he must count on no one but himself, that he is alone, abandoned on earth in the midst of his infinite responsibilities, without help, with no other aim than the one he sets himself, with no other destiny than the one he forges for himself on this earth. We experience our freedom as angst. This is sometimes translated as anguish or anxiety. It is a term that Kierkegaard used, meaning the terror and essential aloneness I experience when I truly understand my freedom. I am suspended in an absurd universe, and there is no reason that compels me to do X or Y. There is nothing that justifies my decision. Let me give you an example. When I was a kid, my mom would sometimes take me and my brother shopping to the local grocery store, and we would drive in a VW microbus. And because I was the eldest, I got to sit in the front seat, and the front seat with the groceries on my lap. And because in the summertime and the late spring, the VW microbus had no air conditioning, we would drive along the road with the windows down. Do you know what was going through my mind, what I struggled with the whole way from the grocery store home as we're speeding along the highway? It is the thought, if you wanted to, you could throw those groceries out the window and they'd scatter all over the road. It would be glorious. And I would sit there and go, no. And then we get home and I'd be soaked in sweat. I wouldn't actually be soaked in sweat, but that was me being confronted by my choice. Or if you've ever been along a hike where the path goes along a cliff face, or if you've been in a hot air balloon, what is it that your brain says to you? We talked about this with Freud and Thanatos, the death drive. But here it's a little different. Well, what does your brain say to you? It says, jump. You can do it. You'd be splattered on the ground, but you could do it. And you kind of step back from the side of the path, and you're like, whoa, I'm really having a hard time with heights, you guys. Now, what if these are not exceptional or strange experiences, but only moments of clarity, moments of existential clarity? They are glimpses when we see and understand that the rest of our lives are to be surrounded by angst, because we recognize the necessity of choosing our path moment by moment, with nobody telling us this is the way to go or that is the way to go. But that is not, in fact, how we live our lives. We are always all too ready to slip into predefined roles, to choose ourselves in the future as the good student, the good friend, the cool guy or the cool girl, what a good girlfriend does, what a good boyfriend does. And so have our choices made for us because we have to fulfill these roles. What a good teacher does. We always, that is to say, according to Sartre, slip into bad faith. But in fact, if Sartre is correct, I see my roles and the tasks as things I must do when in fact I don't have to do them. I could always choose otherwise. I could choose to jump. I could choose to throw the groceries. I could choose to not teach and just end the video here. But I see these things as musts, as things I must do, because in that way I shield myself from angst, from the horrible, nauseating reality that it is I who choose in an absurd universe where I am utterly alone. It is only by embracing the nothingness of my existence, my terrible freedom and aloneness and responsibility, and struggling against meaningless, by choosing as a being for itself, who chooses his path, that I escape bad faith. In other words, I must see my life as an unfolding project that balances my transcendence, my freedom to choose, and my facticity, the conditions which determine me, and realize that only I can interpret my own project. I cannot justify it to anyone else, and it is justified in terms of nothing else but my own interpretation. And this wonderful meme from Rick and Morty, through a combination of awareness, free will, and personal responsibility, you can construct your own meaning in a world that intrinsically has none of its own, an absurd universe. Life, therefore, must be a constant battle from slipping into bad faith, into ducking responsibility by finding security in anyone or anything else, because there is no security. And if you're listening, if you remember, this is very, very similar to Kierkegaard's Night of Faith, except we replace the absolute relationship with the absolute God with an absolute relationship to nothingness. The Night of Faith in nothing. Put this way, the quest for authenticity, for manifesting my existence as groundless, is very difficult, if not impossible. The temptations to bad faith are many and subtle, and few, perhaps none, can be completely authentic. Even Ines, in our play, No Exit, who comes closest to being authentic, she allows herself to be defined by the other two. Which leads us to our last point. Being for others. We are not alone, though. Once we become conscious of another, we gain a third type of being for other, l'être pour autre. In one famous passage, Sartre sees the experience of shame as proof of the existence that others exist. In Being in Nothingness, he gives the example of someone looking through a keyhole, spying on a pair of lovers. This person is totally engrossed in his activity. There's only him and what he's doing, But when he hears the floor creak from behind him, something phenomenologically immediately changes in his consciousness. There is someone else, an object. And what's more, in his experience of shame, he realizes that he is an object for this other subject. He is being reduced from the subject to an object. There is a way I can slip out of this person's objectifying gaze, and that is to make him or her an object for me. I can reclaim my subjectivity by making the other into an object, reclaiming my freedom. And I think this is what Sartre meant when he said that the essential nature of relationship is conflict, or more memorably, hell is other people. Now, if the main point of existentialism then is freedom, spontaneity, and conflict with others as threats to my freedom, how, you may ask, could there be any ethics? And I'm sorry, this is my last point. The other point was the penultimate point. This is, how could there be any ethics? Indeed, many have critiqued Sartre's existentialism as being more about style than ethics. Couldn't there be, for instance, an existentialist Nazi? And Sartre said, no, for when I choose for myself, I also choose for all humanity. Close quote. And if you're listening carefully, you should hear echoes of Kant's categorical imperative. Only do those things for which I can make a universal rule that applies to all people. This is what I call the Kantian moment in Sartre. But the problem with this move, it seems to me, is this. How can I have a responsibility to a universal norm, I choose for all humanity, and maintain authenticity, that is, freely choosing without regard to or for universal norms, or without regard for anything or anyone else that isn't me? Isn't choosing for the whole human race necessarily going to land me in bad faith? After all, I have a universal standard telling me what I ought to choose, even if I say I am choosing freely. Unfortunately, Sartre never really answered this question in Being and Nothingness, and I don't think it's coincidental that he drifted quite a bit towards Marxism in his next work, Critique of Dialectical Reason, simply because he was looking for a coherent ethical perspective. And also remember his quote about one thing he takes from belief in God, and that is an absolute good and absolute evil. That comes back. It seems reasonable that the ethical problems, the ethical emptiness associated with existentialism pushed him into a worldview, namely Marxism, where the ethics were a lot clearer. And that may also explain why he was so doggedly loyal to Marxist regimes, even when human rights abuses came to light. I mean, where else are you going to go to get an ethical perspective? The bourgeoisie? Huh. All right, so that is the end of this lecture. Thank you for listening. And I have thereby saved almost an hour of class time, so we have more time for discussion and stuff like that. So, for those of you who are my students, this was part of your homework. For those of you who are not my students, thank you and farewell, and have a great rest of your day.